What most people call hustle culture is often just distraction disguised as progress. Working harder doesn't always create better outcomes. The idea that you should simply outwork everyone else is fundamentally flawed. Here's the truth. You might be operating within a framework that's incapable of delivering the success you're chasing. This is the reality about achievement that rarely gets discussed. Effort without leverage. Most people invest years attempting self-improvement. They focus on becoming more disciplined, efficient, organized, and driven. Yet very few pause to ask a critical question. Is the environment where I'm investing my energy actually capable of generating the outcome I desire? Because certain frameworks are designed for expansion, while others are structured for stagnation. In some contexts, each additional hour creates exponential opportunity, expanded influence, and growing momentum. In other contexts, each additional hour merely sustains the status quo. You develop your abilities, yet the fundamental situation remains unchanged. This is where countless individuals find themselves trapped. They're reliable, they're persistent, they fulfill their obligations and appear consistently, pushing forward relentlessly. Yet life progresses slowly, advancement feels incremental, outcomes seem constrained. They conclude the issue must be internal. They believe they need greater discipline, more vitality, better systems, or a more resilient mentality. However, frequently, the genuine problem lies in their surrounding framework. Effort expands when it encounters leverage. Leverage means a single action generates multiple outcomes. It means something you create today continues functioning tomorrow. It means your contribution impacts beyond a single individual. It means your output persists beyond the moment of completion. Ownership builds leverage. Reach builds leverage. Connections build leverage. Infrastructure builds leverage. These mechanisms enable effort to multiply exponentially. Without them, effort remains proportional. You invest 1 hour, you receive 1 hour of value. You invest 10 hours, you receive 10 hours of value. Everything hinges on the time and energy you personally contribute. That's not expansion. That's sustainability. Genuine expansion begins when effort accumulates, when identical actions continue generating outcomes repeatedly, when something you construct keeps functioning even during your absence, when progress creates momentum rather than resetting daily. The illusion of overnight success. From an external perspective, this appears as rapid achievement. People make comments like, they were fortunate, or it happened instantaneously. Yet from an internal perspective, the experience differs drastically. It feels like finally discovering the optimal environment, like advancing in a direction where circumstances support rather than oppose you. This reveals why the notion that achievement stems solely from discipline is inadequate. Discipline maintains your trajectory. Discipline sustains your concentration and facilitates improvement. However, discipline doesn't determine the magnitude of potential outcomes. The framework determines that. A dedicated individual within a framework lacking leverage becomes reliable. A dedicated individual within a framework containing leverage becomes influential. The distinction isn't effort, it's architecture. And architecture often remains invisible. You observe someone working extended hours. You witness them striving, learning, developing, and advancing. What remains difficult to perceive is their ceiling. You cannot discern whether their contribution compounds over time or vanishes upon completion. You cannot determine whether their effort accumulates or resets daily. This explains widespread confusion. People are executing correctly. They're exerting themselves. They're improving. They're maintaining discipline. Yet outcomes feel smaller than anticipated. This gap generates frustration, and that frustration typically becomes internalized. People begin questioning whether they lack sufficient motivation, intelligence, or focus. Sometimes the genuine problem is more straightforward. They're working diligently in an environment where diligent work doesn't scale. They're pushing within a framework never designed to multiply effort. And no quantity of motivation can repair a structure that absorbs rather than amplifies energy. Achievement transforms the moment this becomes apparent.
Asking better questions. The question evolves. Rather than asking, how can I work harder, you begin asking, where should my work exist? Rather than attempting to extract additional effort from yourself, you begin seeking environments where effort expands. Because once effort enters the optimal framework, everything transforms. Progress accelerates, opportunities emerge more frequently, abilities develop faster, outcomes begin stacking rather than restarting. Not because you suddenly transformed fundamentally, but because your effort finally has space to accumulate. You don't need to exhaust yourself, but you must identify the appropriate environment for thriving. That's the element rarely emphasized. Achievement isn't solely about work intensity, it's about whether your working environment permits that effort to expand or keeps it confined in repetitive cycles. Success through subtraction. Achievement accelerates more through removal than addition. The conventional narrative insists you need more discipline, more routines, more habits, more projects, more concepts. Continue accumulating actions until something eventually succeeds. This approach feels productive because you're constantly active, constantly moving, constantly engaged. Yet, achievement rarely emerges from accumulation. It emerges from eliminating what fragments your attention, so meaningful priorities can establish themselves and flourish. Eventually, progress ceases being about expansion and becomes about curation. You stop asking, what else should I pursue, and begin asking, what is draining energy from what genuinely matters? Most people resist this transition because elimination feels like sacrifice. It feels like closing opportunities, abandoning options, and refusing things that appear valuable, interesting, or compelling. Maintaining all possibilities feels safer, it feels adaptable, it feels responsible. Yet, maintaining all possibilities dilutes your attention, and when attention dilutes, nothing accumulates. Consider attempting to build momentum across 5 directions simultaneously. Each effort receives a fraction of your focus, yet never sufficient for genuine depth. You remain busy, certainly, yet progress feels superficial. You improve, yet nothing accelerates. You work, yet results reset repeatedly. This is the pitfall. Achievement demands the opposite. It demands concentration. And concentration isn't something you magically acquire. It's something you construct by eliminating alternatives. You withdraw from projects that don't advance your primary trajectory. You minimize distractions that continuously interrupt your thinking. You release expectations that keep pulling you sideways. You stop pursuing every opportunity merely because it exists. The power of focused attention. The external world often interprets this as reduced activity, yet internally it feels like engaging with what genuinely matters, perhaps for the first time. Because when attention consolidates, transformation begins occurring differently. Abilities develop faster because you persist with them adequately. Understanding deepens because you're not perpetually switching contexts. Opportunities connect because your direction is evident. Progress becomes apparent not because you suddenly work harder, but because your effort finally remains concentrated long enough to expand. This is the aspect rarely discussed, though, the phase where achievement makes life narrower before it makes it broader. You decline more frequently, you simplify your direction, you permit fewer things to compete for your time. The chaos decreases, but so does that sensation of constant activity. It can feel uncomfortable, even sluggish, because you're no longer bouncing between distractions. Yet beneath that surface, something powerful begins forming: momentum.
once momentum takes hold. Once effort is positioned within the optimal framework and the chaos begins subsiding, something subtle begins shifting. Initially, it's nearly imperceptible. The work still appears identical externally, the days still feel occupied, the effort is still necessary, nothing feels extraordinary. Yet internally, progress begins behaving differently. Rather than restarting daily, it begins carrying forward. You notice that actions from last month still benefit you presently. Abilities build upon each other rather than resetting. Decisions become easier because you possess context. Opportunities begin connecting to one another rather than appearing randomly and vanishing equally quickly. This is when focus transforms into momentum. Momentum isn't velocity, it's continuity. It occurs when your energy remains directed consistently long enough for outcomes to accumulate. One action supports the subsequent one. One improvement strengthens the following one. One relationship leads to another. The journey stops feeling like isolated steps and begins feeling like a continuous line advancing. Most people never experience this because their attention keeps resetting perpetually. They shift between objectives, environments, and priorities, so progress never accumulates. They work diligently, certainly, yet that work remains isolated. Momentum demands duration. It demands remaining committed long enough for compounding to commence. And compounding? It's subtle initially. In early phases, outcomes still appear modest, effort still feels substantial, progress still seems gradual compared to expectations. This is when many people assume nothing is occurring and redirect their course again. Yet, beneath the surface, a structure is developing. The compound effect. Understanding deepens because you remain proximate to identical challenges. Abilities sharpen because repetition now constructs rather than repeats. Someone might claim 5 years of experience, yet in reality they experienced the identical year 5 times, like repeating the identical grade repeatedly. Time elapses, yet depth never develops. There's no singular day when everything transforms. Instead, there's a period when progress becomes smoother. There's reduced friction, fewer restarts, greater carryover from previous effort. You begin investing less energy determining approaches and more energy implementing. Decisions that once felt challenging become instinctive. Patterns become recognizable. Mistakes occur faster, what so do corrections. This is when effort begins producing disproportionate outcomes. The framework amplifies you, focus stabilizes you, momentum propels you. Externally, this often appears as acceleration. People notice you advancing faster. They assume you discovered a shortcut or experienced fortunate timing. It appears as though progress suddenly became effortless. Yet internally, the reality differs. What they perceive as velocity is actually accumulation finally becoming apparent. Because that work has been stacking for months, penitently years. The focus has been narrowing, the distractions have been eliminated, the framework has been functioning quietly behind the scenes. Momentum is simply the phase when all of that becomes noticeable. When opportunity finds you. And once it appears, the nature of opportunity transforms. You no longer pursue everything, the appropriate things begin finding you. Projects align with your trajectory, people contact you because your path is evident. Decisions become less about exploration and more about selection. You begin choosing between aligned possibilities rather than searching blindly. This is where leverage begins emerging. Leverage isn't something you force, it occurs when 3 conditions exist simultaneously. You're within a framework that multiplies effort, you've eliminated sufficient chaos to maintain focus, and you've remained committed long enough for that momentum to develop. This explains why achievement often appears sudden externally. People never see the positioning phase. They never see the elimination phase. They never witness the extended period when momentum quietly forms behind the scenes. They only notice the moment when everything begins connecting. The real path forward. And the path to that moment resembles nothing like the mindless hustle culture that people romanticize. It's not about doing more. It's not about staying busy. It's not about grinding yourself into depletion. It's about positioning your effort where it can expand, eliminating what fragments your attention, and remaining committed long enough for the work to compound. That's the element nobody promotes, and it's the only element that genuinely creates achievement. That's it for today. See you next time. Until then, take care.